The armorer had watched thousands of soldiers come through his range, but this one stood out. Her uniform looked freshly pressed, her posture loose, her questions about the M4 almost too basic. She listened to the qualifying course rundown with a calm, steady gaze, giving nothing away. When the timer started, something changed. Her movements snapped into place, precise and efficient. She cleared malfunctions by touch alone. Each shot landed tighter, forming a single jagged hole in the target. By midday, the armorer was already digging through old files. 20 years back, her record showed a distinguished marksman badge and 3 combat tours. Her personnel photo revealed a younger woman gripping a rifle, her eyes carrying a weight that didn't match her age. What did her records really reveal? On paper, she was just another reservist checking a box. She signed in as J. Reynolds. No rank, no unit, nothing but the minimum. Her uniform was regulation perfect. Crisp, boots polished, no insignia beyond her name tape and the US Army tag. She looked like someone who belonged behind a desk, not on a firing line. But her stance, the way she settled her weight, told a different story, one the armorer couldn't quite place. Her file listed her as an administrative specialist with a personnel services battalion. The kind of job that filled cubicles and managed paperwork, not one that handed out rifles. She accepted the M4 with both hands, holding it like it was unfamiliar. The buttstock sat wrong against her shoulder, her cheek hovering a little too high on the comb. The armorer watched, puzzled. For someone so composed, she handled the weapon like a beginner until something in her posture hinted at a deeper comfort, masked by deliberate caution. The range staff ran through the safety briefing. She listened quietly, nodding, never asking for clarification. Around her, a few younger Marines waited, already bracing for the usual delays. They'd seen it before. Clerks who fumbled magazines, who needed repeated instructions, who slowed everyone down. The expectation was set. She didn't challenge it. At the line, she took her assigned position with careful precision, shifting her feet and adjusting her grip as if reacquainting herself with old habits. Loading her first magazine, she moved slowly, methodically, drawing a few sidelong glances. The safety officer edged closer, anticipating the need to step in. The armorer found himself watching more closely than usual, curiosity edging into skepticism. He wondered why someone so relaxed on the line handled the rifle like a novice until the first shot shattered his assumption. The initial report sounded tentative, the round landing just outside the bullseye. Another followed, then a third, each spaced out, deliberate. The safety officer started forward, ready to offer pointers, but something in her focus made him pause. The range quieted just a bit, attention shifting. No one expected much from the clerk with the perfect uniform and the empty hands. But as the next round left the barrel, a subtle change in her rhythm caught the armorer's eye. Her movements grew more confident, her grip settling into something practiced. The line waited, watching, as the pattern of her shooting began to shift. Her first shots landed with a measured pace, each one separated by a deliberate pause. Through the spotting scope, the initial group told a quiet story. 2 rounds edged just outside the bullseye, one drifted wide. The range safety officer started forward, ready to offer guidance, but then her next round punched clean through the center. The following shots snapped into place, each one drawing the group tighter. By the 4th, her rounds cut through the X-ring. By the 9th, the cluster on the paper had merged into a single ragged hole. There was no hesitation now. Her breathing evened out, her trigger pull became a steady rhythm. She didn't fumble with the rifle or glance at her sights for reassurance. Instead, she watched the target, reading the feedback from each shot, making silent adjustments. The pace picked up, not rushed, but confident, the kind of tempo that comes from years of repetition. The sound of her rifle lost its uncertain cadence and settled into something practiced. A few Marines on the line lowered their own weapons, attention shifting from their targets to hers. The initial impression of a desk-bound reservist faded with each well-placed shot. What looked like beginner's luck revealed itself as method. She wasn't just firing to qualify. She was confirming the rifle's zero, checking the relationship between her aim and the rifle's point of impact. She made no visible adjustments, but the grouping told the story. She understood the process, the variables, the way a true marksman does. Behind the line, the armorer scanned her range card again. It was the same as before: administrative specialty, nothing notable. But in the corner, nearly hidden beneath years of handling, he caught a faded stamp. His breath caught when he recognized it. Distinguished, nearly erased, dated from 2 decades prior. It was a mark he hadn't seen in years, one reserved for shooters who'd proven themselves at the highest level. The realization unsettled him. On the line, Reynolds reloaded with a smooth, practiced motion. She didn't check her work or pause to catch her breath. Her hands worked automatically, magazine seating with a clean click, bolt dropping forward in one fluid motion. Brass landed in a neat pile at her feet. Every movement, from stance to trigger press, spoke of ingrained habit, not the nervous mimicry of someone new to the range. When her last shot echoed downrange, the safety officer stepped back, silent. The Marines, who'd expected a slow qualifier, now watched her with something closer to respect. The target was a tight cluster of holes, nothing wasted. It was the kind of shooting that didn't just come from practice, but from necessity. The range fell quiet for a moment, anticipation shifting. The qualification timer was about to start, and all eyes turned to Reynolds, waiting to see what came next. The malfunction drill wasn't part of the plan, but it came without warning. Reynolds' rifle seized halfway through her second stringer double feed, 2 rounds jammed together in the chamber. The range safety officer shifted, ready to call a ceasefire, but she moved before he could speak. In one motion, her left hand dropped the magazine, her right thumb hit the bolt release, and a slim clearing rod slid from her pocket. She didn't look at the weapon, didn't break rhythm. The rod slipped through the ejection port, both rounds popped free, and the mag was back in before the clock hit 3 seconds. Manuals taught the steps, but not the speed. Her hands worked with a certainty that spoke of repetition under pressure, not just practice on a range. That kind of speed wasn't taught to clerks. It was learned in places where a jammed rifle could mean everything. Her time in the 75th Ranger Regiment demanded that kind of reflex. The Marines on the line went still, watching the sequence play out. They'd all rehearsed immediate action drills, but not like this. Her movements cut out anything extra, no hesitation, no wasted effort. The clearing rod was personal kit, not something handed out at the armory. She carried it for a reason. Reynolds brought the rifle back up and finished her course as if nothing had happened. The brass from the malfunction landed with the rest, no sign she'd even noticed. When the relay ended, a junior NCO lingered by her station, eyeing her gear. Everything was arranged with quiet purpose. Spare magazines lined up, cleaning kit exactly placed, hydration pack within reach. The details weren't for show. They were habits built for low light, for dust, for times when you couldn't afford to fumble. He asked about her clearing technique. She held up the rod plane, polished from use. "Saves time," she said. Nothing more. When he pressed for where she'd learned it, she just looked at him, silent. The answer wasn't coming. Later, a few Marines adjusted their own setups, but it wasn't about imitation. It was about understanding there was more to learn, something their manuals hadn't covered. No one knew her story yet, but nobody on the line would ever look at a clearing rod the same way again. Some questions lingered between the spent brass and the silent glances. The curiosity didn't fade as the range emptied, and someone decided to look just a little deeper. The lieutenant waited until the last of the brass was swept up before reaching for Reynolds' file. The top pages held nothing out of place: reserve status, years of administrative postings, a string of annual qualifications that barely met the minimum. But further down, an attachment marked restricted access in faded red stood out. Her file revealed 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 silver stars in Anaconda and Koringal, and a patella shattered on a combat jump in 2007. Her move to personnel was not a demotion but a self-imposed peace after surgery made jumps impossible. He scanned the evaluations. Buried in dry language were details that painted a different picture. She'd kept weapons running in the mud and cold, moved ammunition under fire, and held a team together when everything else broke down. Her last active duty range sheet listed expert on 6 different weapon systems, the date just months before her medical discharge. He barely had time to process it when footsteps sounded in the doorway. Reynolds stood there, duffel in hand, waiting. She didn't ask about the file or the way he paused over the medical notes. She didn't explain the scars that must have run beneath her uniform, or the reason she moved with a careful patience that wasn't quite limp. She just waited until he slid the folder across the desk, then took it and left without a word. The lieutenant considered saying something, maybe a question about the past, or a thank you for what she'd done, but nothing seemed right. The file in his hands felt heavier than before. She never bragged, never offered stories, never tried to correct anyone's assumptions. Later, the battalion clerk mentioned Reynolds had filed a request for night shifts, nothing more. The form was routine, but the timing made it stick. The lieutenant watched her load her truck in the lot, saw the battered rifle case handled with quiet care, the cab clear of anything that might hint at her service. There were no stickers, no plates, just a worn license tag and a single duffel tossed in the back. That evening, he pulled the day's range records. Her target stood out in rounds, a group no bigger than $50, the same pattern he'd seen in her old qualification sheets. The years hadn't dulled her skill. He sat with that knowledge for a while, thinking about what it meant to carry a story no one else could read. The next week, the range took on a different feel. The first to arrive that week were the junior enlisted Marines, the ones who usually kept to the back of the qualification line. They didn't crowd around Reynolds, but they found lanes nearby, setting up with quiet hands and sidelong glances. Their gear was standard issue, their movements tentative. They watched her more than they watched their own targets. Reynolds loaded her magazines with an even, practiced pressure, never rushing. She checked her sights not by peering down the barrel, but by feeling the rifle's weight settle in her grip. The way she breathed before each shot halfway out, held still, became a rhythm the others tried to match. A few unconsciously mirrored her stance, squaring their shoulders, elbows pulled in. Most didn't speak, but they watched every detail. Around midday, a lance corporal with a nervous grip lingered at the edge of Reynolds' lane. She waited until Reynolds paused between magazines and asked, "Any advice?" Reynolds didn't answer right away. She just handed over her rifle and nodded at the target. The lance corporal tried to mimic what she'd seen: relaxed grip, steady trigger. The difference was immediate. Her shots tightened, the pattern shrinking with each round. Reynolds watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You're anticipating recoil." She didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened, a brief flicker of recognition. That was all it took. By the end of the afternoon, 6 Marines who'd never qualified higher than marksman posted expert scores. They didn't celebrate or draw attention, but the range staff took note. The shift was quiet, but clear. Watching Reynolds was the lesson the manuals couldn't teach. The changes went beyond shot groups. The Marines started clearing malfunctions with the same smooth motion they'd seen from Reynolds. Reloads grew faster, more deliberate. Fewer rounds were wasted. Each improvement came from observation and a few words of direct feedback. The effect rippled through the ranger skill, passed from one set of hands to another, not by instruction but by example. By the end of the month, the qualification logs told the story. Female Marines filled the top slots, their scores clustered close, the improvement too consistent to ignore. The rangemaster noticed the pattern. Anyone who shot near Reynolds improved. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, and it showed up every time the targets were collected. Reynolds kept to herself. She shot, packed up, and left with the same quiet routine. But every so often, she'd pause at a lane where a new shooter stood, glance at a target, and give a small nod. No words, just a moment of acknowledgement. For the Marines who received it, that was enough a sign that they'd done something right, and that someone who knew what right looked like had noticed. As the last targets came down and the range emptied out, a sense of something shared lingered between the lanes, nothing spoken, but understood by all who'd watched and learned. The coin appeared just before closing, left on the rangemaster's desk among the scattered forms and spent casings. He picked it up, feeling its weight-solid brass, warm from a pocket. One side showed the ranger scroll and tab. The other bore service dates, 2002, 2008. No note, no ceremony. Reynolds was already gone, blending into the evening in jeans and a plain jacket, nothing left but the coin's silent message. He turned it over, running a thumb along the softened engraving. This wasn't a mass-produced keepsake. The edges were worn, the surface dulled by years of handling. It was personal, carried daily, not for display, but for memory. The dates matched what he'd glimpsed in her restricted file, but it was the inscription that drew him up short. A single word, etched beneath the tab still. The next morning, word spread quietly. The lance corporal who'd asked Reynolds for advice found a coin just like it in her range bag. The others, those who'd watched, learned, and posted expert scores after her visit, each discovered one. No two coins were perfectly identical. Each showed the marks of years in a pocket or kit, but all bore the same insignia, the same dates, the same word. No explanations came with them. The coins didn't celebrate excellence or mark an official achievement. They were a private acknowledgement, a nod from someone who had lived what she taught. The lance corporal kept hers with her badge, running her thumb over the word whenever nerves crept in. Another coin hung from a gear loop, the brass dulled by sweat and weather. For some, it became a kind of talisman, proof that they'd earned the respect of someone who measured skill by action, not by talk. The message was clear enough. You know what it means now. Carry it forward. Reynolds didn't come back to the range that month. She logged her reserve hours in the office, processed forms, kept to herself. But when she passed the lance corporal in the hall, she held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. It was enough. The coins needed no further explanation. The rangemaster slipped his coin behind Reynolds' last qualification sheet, a quiet record, not an official entry. He'd seen challenge coins change hands before, but never like this. No crowd, no handshake, just a private gesture left for those who understood. In time, the coins traveled. They showed up on deployments, tucked in gear, carried through dust and rain. They became more than keepsake markers of a standard learned by watching, not by instruction. Those coins would surface in deployments, turning private keepsakes into shared symbols of what true ranger skill looks like. And back at the range, something subtle shifted. Lane 3 sat empty, even on the busiest weekends. New shooters sometimes asked about it. The range staff would answer with a quick, "It's reserved," and leave it at that. No one posted a sign or made an announcement. The absence became its own explanation, understood by those who'd watched Reynolds work the line and those who'd only heard the stories secondhand. A small cluster of spent brass lay just beyond the firing line, right where her ejection pattern always landed. The shells had weathered through months of rain and sun, their copper dulled to a soft brown, edges worn smooth from boots stepping carefully around them. No one swept them up. Maintenance crews power-washed the concrete, but left that patch untouched. The brass stayed, a quiet memorial that caught the afternoon light in a way that drew the eye, if only for a moment. The regulars respected the space. Some avoided it out of habit, others from something closer to reverence. Marines who'd once dismissed Reynolds now kept their distance, remembering how their own assumptions had shifted with every shot she fired. The female Marines who'd learned from her example booked lanes 2 and 4, never 3. They'd glance at the empty spot as they reloaded, sometimes pausing just a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for her to return. One afternoon, a new lieutenant paused at the briefing table and nodded toward the vacant lane. The room went still. Before anyone from the staff could answer, a corporal spoke, voice steady, eyes on the lane. "Respect, sir." The word hung in the air, settling any further questions. The lieutenant caught the looks from the older shooters and let the matter drop. That was all anyone needed to say. As months passed, the empty lane grew into a kind of legend. Stories spread and changed some, said it belonged to a special forces operator, others to a Marine who'd held a position under fire. The truth slipped into range lore. the details less important than the effect. The lane was once a clerk's domain, now it stood silent, a monument to lessons learned without a word. The brass remained, weathered and unmoved, marking the spot for anyone who cared enough to notice. Sometimes, a visitor would pocket a casing, but by morning, another would appear in its place, set down quietly by someone who understood. The space endured, not for ceremony, but for memory. Those who watched from the benches, or waited for their turn on the line, knew it meant something. They didn't need to ask what. Years later, someone looking through old records would pause at a name, a date, a photograph, searching for the story behind the silence that lingered at Lane 3. Official records held their own kind of silence. The historian, searching deployment logs from Kunar province, came across a black and white photograph. It showed a soldier, face streaked with camouflage, leaning against a battered wall. The caption read, "J. Reynolds, Sergeant." The woman in the photo didn't match the image of a quiet clerk in an office. Her eyes were focused, her gear arranged for utility, not inspection. On the back, 3 lines in faded ink. Held OP, 47 minutes solo. 18 Sikia. Declined medal. The after-action report filled in the rest. In 2005, during a reconnaissance patrol, Reynolds' team was ambushed while exfiltrating from an observation post. 2 wounded, the rest pinned down. She held her position in a collapsed building, laying down controlled fire for 47 minutes, keeping enemy fighters at bay until help arrived. 18 confirmed kills, switching weapons as each jammed or ran dry. The paperwork told the story without embellishment. What stood out wasn't just the action, but what followed. Reynolds refused the Silver Star. The recommendation vanished, replaced by a simple letter of commendation. She insisted she'd done what anyone would do. The historian found that letter buried under years of routine forms, performance reviews, supply certifications, nothing that hinted at that day in Kunar. Extraordinary service, hidden beneath the weight of paperwork. The contrast was sharp. One file listed a reservist with unremarkable scores, the other described a soldier who'd once fired 200 rounds without losing control. No explanations, no notes about why a ranger with that history moved to personnel. Only a medical entry, knee injury, surgery, the kind that ends a certain kind of career. The historian compared the old photo to her latest ID. The hair was shorter, the lines deeper, but the eyes hadn't changed. He thought about the coins she'd left behind, the lane kept empty, the lessons passed on by presence alone. It reminded him of other stories, veterans who let their actions stand, who turned down recognition, who didn't need to explain. He closed the file and returned it to the archive. Extraordinary service buried beneath routine, forms only those who remembered Lane 3 could see the truth. Some skills never need a medal to be recognized. Some lessons are passed on in silence, visible only in the way a shooter settles their stance or clears a malfunction without a word. Reynolds left no speeches, just brass on concrete and coins quietly placed for those who watched closely. The empty lane remains no sign, no explanation, just a quiet reminder that real skill doesn't announce itself. Have you ever learned more from watching than from words? Share that story below, because real skill earns respect in silence. Next time you see headlines or ribbons, remember, the quiet ones at the line often carry the richest history.